Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Blair Embry. I'm the Community Engagement Manager for Prison Yoga Project, and we are so excited about our guest today, Anusha Wijeyakumar. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Blair, for having me. I'm delighted to be in community with you all today. I've been looking forward to this conversation.
Me too. And I know our audience is really excited. And this is really just at the heart of our work is decolonizing our practice of the way that we serve. So I wanted to read your bio as well. I know I had asked Anusha, I was like, do you have a condensed bio? Because you do so much that I want to do all of your work service, and it's so diverse. It's really amazing. So this is just a small section of the amazing work that Anusha brings to our world, really. Anusha has her master's, and she's a RYT, is a renowned motivational speaker in the science of mindfulness and meditation. Anusha is the wellness consultant for Hoag Hospital in Orange County, California, where she is actively engaged in championing. I'm so sorry. Mindfulness and meditation practices for maternal mental health programs, early risk assessment for breast and ovarian cancer prevention programs, and breast cancer survivorship programs. Anusha is the daughter of Sri Lankan immigrant parents, raised in the philosophy of Sanatana Dharma. She is a lifelong student of Hinduism and Buddhism. Anusha is passionate about honoring the roots of yoga and educating people on the importance of decolonizing these practices. She is the author of Meditation with Intention, Quick and Easy Ways to Create Lasting Peace. Everyone, please welcome Anusha.
Thank you so much, Blair. A true honor to be here with you all. And I'm really looking forward to getting a chance to be in community. And we really want to hear from the audience that's joined us today so we can have an engaging and fruitful dialogue.
Yes. And before we start, we like to get everyone on the same page. Would you mind leading us in a centering opportunity?
I would love to.
Awesome. Thank
and
you.
I'll also just be reading a short excerpt from my book, Meditation with Intention, as well. So wherever you are, just come to a comfortable seat or position. And often this is best done sitting in a chair. I talk about this a lot with my patients at Hoag Hospital, often who have cancer. And so sitting on the floor, first of all, on the West, sitting on the floor isn't accessible to most of us because we just don't do it. So I always encourage students and patients to just find a comfortable seat. Sitting in a chair can be great, especially one that does have back support. So wherever you are, just come to a comfortable seat. You can close the eyes if you wish to, but you don't have to close the eyes. You can remain with the eyes open. What I would encourage you to do if you are remaining with the eyes open is to stare at a focal point on the ground, which just can help us to begin withdrawing one of our main senses of sight. And just allow the mind and body to come into that place of stillness and of quiet within. As we take a moment to gently relax the shoulders down away from the ears, relaxing and releasing the muscles in the face, any tension in the neck, the jaw area, releasing the point between the eyebrows, releasing the tongue from the hard palate of the roof of the mouth. And just taking a moment to arrive into this moment, into the physical body. Allowing the day that has been to pass, not concerning yourself with what is to come. If thoughts are coming into the mind, that is completely fine and normal. But just allow any thought forms that may be arising to gently drift away like clouds in the sky as you return to your body and your breath, your body and your breath, your body and your breath. And I want you all in this moment to relax, because there is no doing this practice wrong. If there are any external sounds, just let them be. And start to notice the shape, the weight of your breath in your body, the gentle rising and the falling. And just notice how your breath feels in this moment. Is it long and smooth, or is it short and shallow? You're not trying to breathe in any particular way right now. You are simply breathing as it comes. There are no need for judgments or opinions here. If you have any, just allow those to gently drift away like clouds in the sky, returning to your body and your breath, your body and your breath, your body and your breath. And now I want you to take your attention to the chest and belly area and just become aware of the movement there as you breathe. Just feel the movement. Again, you're not trying to breathe in any particular way. You are just simply breathing as it comes. If thoughts are coming into the mind, that is completely fine and normal. But just allow any thought forms that may be arising to gently drift away like clouds in the sky, returning to your body and your breath, your body and your breath, your body and your breath. And now I invite you to make a connection with the physical body, if that feels good to you in this moment. Perhaps gently drawing the right hand to the abdomen, left hand on the heart space, or making any connection to the physical body that serves you in this moment. Or just remaining where you are. And now really focus on lengthening the inhale and deepening the exhalation. When we take an inhale and we take an exhale, we are enabled to bring the body and mind together as one, and to remain, as a result, firmly anchored in this present moment. So I want you to do that 6 times at your own pace, to your own count, but really focusing on lengthening that exhalation. It's that lengthened exhale that activates the parasympathetic nervous system response in our body, which is the aspect of our central nervous system that moves us away from that constant state of fight or flight into that rest and digest response. So really connecting with your breath, connecting with your body, keeping yourself firmly anchored in the present moment. And as you inhale, I offer an intention that you can silently repeat to yourself. I am at peace. And the intention that I offer as you exhale is all is well in my world. So really feel a sense of peace washing over you in this moment as you inhale. And allow yourself to feel as you exhale that all is well in your world, regardless of your external situation or circumstance. In this moment, as you inhale, you are at peace. And in this moment, as you exhale, all is well in your world. And really allow yourself to feel a sense of peace and harmony and balance washing over you. And allow yourself, as you exhale, to release any tension in the physical body or mind, any anxious thoughts. Just feel that you are releasing that as you exhale. And once you've completed your 6 rounds of that breathwork pattern, there's no rush or hurry to arrive. Release whenever you do, returning to your normal rhythm and pattern of breathing. And I wanted to offer an excerpt from Meditation with Intention, which talks about meditation and your brain. Part of committing to a daily meditation practice enables you to actually affect your brain function, resulting in better emotional and mental health. Even though research in the West into meditation and its effects is still in its infancy, studies have illustrated that meditation helps to suppress the amygdala, which is the jumpy part of our brain that results in us constantly living in that state of fight or flight. It's like the alarm system always going off in your home for no good reason. The brain is the primary shaper of your mind and in turn your reality. It is always working and uses about the same amount of energy whether you are fast asleep or wide awake. It never gets a break. And even though it only makes up 2% of the body's weight, it uses 25% of the body's oxygen and glucose and 15% of the body's cardiac output. Meditation is a wonderful way to give your brain and mind a much needed time out and go to that place of peace within. So just take a final moment now, wherever you are in this practice. And then start to return your consciousness and your awareness to the physical body, perhaps inviting some movement back into the body, however that looks and feels to you in this moment. You can gently turn the head from right to left, left to right, up and down. And then starting to feel the weight of your body, the weight of your head on your neck. As you slowly and gently blink the eyes open if they were closed, returning to your physical surroundings. So that's a very simplistic practice that I teach my patients at the hospital, and one that I invite you all to begin doing daily. I talk about this a lot in my book, Meditation with Intention, that all it takes is 5 minutes. And I actually work in clinical research and science and STEM at Hoag Hospital. I'm one of the first people to create a meditation program that we're clinically testing for breast cancer patients. And 5 minutes a day of meditation works. And the wonderful thing about Western science is we're now able to verify and correlate that. So the work that I do in science is very dear to my heart, but most of all, spreading this ancient wisdom, which is a part of my indigeneity and ancestral practices, to my patients, students, and the world around me gives me so much joy. And one of the things that I hear so much is, is 5 minutes enough? And yes, it is. So I really encourage you all, if you don't meditate daily, to begin a daily practice. And really nobody can tell me that they don't have 5 minutes.
I don't remember who the quote is, but it's like, oh, if you don't have 20 minutes to practice, then you should practice for an hour. which I love that. But thank you so much for leading us in this really beautiful centering practice. And I'm really excited to share your book with our community as well. And you know what? Let me do that right now because I have the bookshop link. So if you're interested, and this is a great way to support Anusha, is by purchasing and practicing with this book. Yeah. And so we oftentimes start with the same question, and it's, I'm really excited to hear your answer too. What is your first memory of yoga?
So yoga is a practice that is part of my lineage. I was born into the lineage of Shaivaism, Shaiva Sampradaya, which is the essence of yoga, and for me, I don't remember a time when I wasn't practicing yoga, really. So from birth, I was introduced into these practices. And I'll caveat that by saying, and I teach this in terms of decolonization, both at San Diego State University, where I'm a professor, and also just on multiple kind of yoga platforms too. People aren't actually aware of the history of colonization in South Asia and the Indian subcontinent specifically. So for me, being Sri Lankan and Tamil, my ancestors had to resist 443 years of brutal Western imperialism, beginning with the Portuguese, then the Dutch, and finally the British. And so the fact that I was able to be born and raised in this lineage and the philosophy of yoga is a testament to my ancestors, for their resilience, their strength, their courage, their fortitude. And so being here with you all today and doing all of the work that I do is an ode to them. Because without their resistance against proselytization, colonization, and a very wretched and brutal European imperialism, I wouldn't be able, quite frankly, to do the work that I do. And that's why the conversation of decolonization and the importance of adopting a decolonial mindset is pivotal in yoga and beyond.
Thank you. And yeah, let's get into it. Decolonizing wellness. So even just hearing, almost 500 years of oppression and violence, and really stealing and erasure of culture and practice. And I think a lot of people in this community are yoga practitioners, right? Whether it's through meditation, any of the 8 limbs of yoga, whatever their interpretation. And as we know, yoga is vast in its container. So where would you start in this conversation of decolonizing our practice or decolonizing wellness?
So I think let's begin with yoga, and then, which is obviously a part of certainly what we deem to be wellness, has always been, but what we deem to be wellness in the West. Yoga has been so commercialized and commoditized that what we perceive to be yoga in the West really isn't anything to do with yoga. I mean, the first step, let's think about a very simplistic way we can begin this framework of adopting a decolonial mindset. Yoga is an asana. It's the first step. And so often in the West, we associate yoga as asana. If we go back to Sage Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, the classical yoga text that most people are familiar with in the West, asana is but one of the 8 limbs. And, yoga was actually first mentioned in the Upanishads, the Katha Upanishads specifically. Another one of our ancient Vedic and Hindu scriptures, where it was expounded in detail, and pranayama was mentioned, meditation was mentioned. So I think there's also this disconnect of where yoga, what scripture first mentioned yoga, what it means. And we don't have time. I teach this, but we don't have time to get into all of that today, right? So the first step is understand that yoga isn't asana. That's step 1. And I really want to focus on that. And listen, when I say this, people think, oh, this is an attack on asana. I love asana. It's one of the ways that I move my body on a regular weekly basis. It's one of my practices of intentional movement. So this isn't saying that asana isn't healthy. helpful, asana isn't useful, asana doesn't have a multitude of benefits to it. It does. It's all of the above, right? Moving our body is vital to our physical and mental health and well-being. However, equating yoga as just asana keeps it, first of all, very ableist, because let's be honest, most of the asana that we're taught in the West isn't inclusive, isn't accessible. And so then we get into this kind of white gatekeeping. So then who is asana even accessible to? Who feels included? Who is represented? All of this, which is antithetical to the philosophy of yoga, right? Number one. So yoga isn't asana. Asana is one aspect of yoga. And all of the ancient texts tell us that asana is not the way that we are going to be able to liberate our minds and transcend our suffering. So this hyper focus on asana in the West, quite frankly, does us all a disservice. I always like to give examples because I find that this is helpful. So for me, I work in multiple settings, as Blair has mentioned, but one of them is in a clinical setting. And I'm at clinic, twice a month with my patients who are predominantly breast and ovarian cancer patients at Hoag Hospital in Orange County. And I walk into the room, the patient's waiting for me. And I say, are you familiar with yoga? And they immediately say, oh, I can't do yoga. I'm not flexible enough. I'm not strong enough. I don't feel welcome enough. And then I have to go into, which I think is a facet of all of my work, that, well, okay, let's decolonize that. Meditation is yoga. Mindfulness is yoga. And that's the truth. And even if we look at Sage Patanjali's 8-limb path, we shouldn't even be practicing asana if we're not practicing the yamas and the niyamas. And think about those as our yogic ethics, right? And so, and then we come to the next part. So what is yoga? Yoga is a philosophy, and it's a philosophy that can truly help us to interrupt harm, to dismantle systems of oppression, and to liberate ourselves and others, right? So in the time that we are in, when we think about the philosophy of yoga specifically, it's an individual path of liberation, but individual liberation is intimately connected to collective care and collective liberation in the time that we are in. Because ultimately, the philosophy of yoga teaches us that we are all interconnected. But how do we move beyond the "we are all one, let's send love and light," all of these empty slogans that are popularized within mainstream yoga and wellness settings, but ultimately become very empty if we're not actually able to put our practice into action, in our own lives, in our own hearts, in our own minds, and then in our communities and wider society.
Thank you. And so what I'm hearing is first decolonizing our understanding that yoga is not asana. Yoga is not just asana, right? It's really seeing the philosophy and the larger framework of what it is. And I really love hearing you say that we actually shouldn't even practice asana if we're not practicing the yamas and the niyamas, because what I heard immediately was just then it's just egoic, right? Like if we're not caring for ourselves and our community, then it really is just a selfish practice.
Very much so. Very much so. And think about, listen, search yoga. That's what I always tell people to go to Google and put in yoga. And what comes up? A cishet, able-bodied, thin, white women, predominantly, in difficult asana postures, typically inversions, right? So what is that teaching us, right? Ultimately, it's all rooted in egoism. And the yamas and yamas are one framework. Also within Sage Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, we have the kleshas, the mental afflictions of the mind. And the first klesha is avidya, which is ignorance, right? The second klesha is asmita, egoism. We can't get beyond, and actually Sage Patanjali teaches us that if we can get beyond ignorance, we can overcome all of the other 4 remaining kleshas, but we're rooted in ignorance. We're rooted in egoism. And we don't even have to think about this in terms of the rest of the world or America. We're deeply rooted in ego in yoga. And because yoga, wellness is a $1 trillion industry. Yoga has been so capitalized and commercialized and commoditized and bastardized. And because yoga sells, people don't want to adopt a decolonial mindset. People don't want to take a step back and think, wow, okay, asana is great, but obviously there's a lot more to yoga, and illustrating and equating yoga as just asana does us all a disservice, and again makes the practice inaccessible to many. And that's when we think about that question of decolonizing wellness. Who gets to be well? And we know who gets to be well, right? Whose wellness is always centered? And we know whose wellness is always centered. It's the dominant culture. And so for BIPOC, we continue to be marginalized from what actually are our traditions. And there's other, aside from yoga, there are multiple different BIPOC traditions focused on wellness that the dominant culture also continues to center themselves in, and then sell them back to the dominant culture and the indigenous cultures from which these practices came from. So all of these are the questions that we should be posing as part of, as another example, one of our Niyama Svadhyaya self-study. Are we thinking about this? Yeah. Are we examining our own proximity, right, to privilege, our own proximity to power? And yoga was never a practice that was meant to have us sit in our comfort and sit in our privilege. And let's be honest, that's most of what we see in mainstream yoga and wellness. In fact, the philosophy of yoga is quite the opposite. It gives us the tools in order for us to lean into areas of discomfort so we can get out of comfort, right? Be comfortable sitting in discomfort so we can get to the root cause of our own suffering, which is very much tied to those kleshas, mental afflictions of the mind, in order for us to liberate ourselves, right? And once we can do that, of course, in turn, we want to focus on liberating others, right? And our siblings, and really dismantling those systems of oppression that are so inequitable and so unjust in America and beyond.
And this practice and this philosophy and this framework that is meant and created and supported for liberation, the way that the West has taken it has actually made more prisoners of suffering. It's repackaging and selling, but it's not even selling liberation. It has missed the thread.
And it will continue, from what I'm seeing, that, and it doesn't want to, because selling yoga as something that it isn't is very profitable. And that's the ultimate problem, right? So why would you, especially as the dominant culture, why would you want to adopt a decolonial mindset? Why would you want to repair harm when ultimately your perception, right, because of that ignorance, because of that ego, is that it'll be a disservice to you, versus looking at the bigger picture and understanding the philosophy of yoga, that is of urgent need in the time that we are in.
What are any other steps? And I know that you do long training on this, right? And so much of your work is rooted in decolonizing. So really, like an hour and a half isn't going to be able to scratch the surface. But in the beginning of this conversation, what else would you offer to our audience as maybe topics to explore or practical ways really to decolonize our practice?
Understand that yoga is an asana and just sit with that. That seems to be honestly the area. It sounds really simple. This is the thing. A lot of it is actually quite simple. We just don't want to do it. So there's a few quick and easy ways that we can do that. Understand that yoga is an asana, number one. To also start to divest, your time and your resources away from teachers and platforms that are constantly peddling this information, to really start to center Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and especially center South Asian voices and teachers when it comes to teaching decolonizing yoga, because we have a very recent history of colonization. And so for us, as part of this large diaspora, it's very triggering and traumatic to be constantly erased from these conversations. And very rarely do you see South Asian teachers platformed in mainstream yoga and wellness. I mean, there's plenty of us out there. So this is now, before we were always told, well, there aren't many of you and we can't find you. All of that's changed. Everything's available online now. Everybody's offering programs, workshops, classes, etc. online. So now the bigger question is, why are people not investing their time and resources in centering South Asian voices in yoga? And that's the question that we should all be asking ourselves. And why are we also not utilizing our resources to be centering Black, Indigenous, and people of color's voices in yoga and wellness? And so those are some very simplistic steps that we as individuals can start taking to begin to practice decolonization, which is very broad. And it's also become a buzzword. Nobody, decolonize your spice shelf, that needs to be done. Decolonize your bookshelf, that needs to be done. So I think what happens is it becomes a buzzword and then people lose interest, right? So 2 years ago, everybody was like, decolonize. And then 2 years later, we see that people don't really have any real commitment to decolonization because it actually takes an honest commitment to unlearning and relearning, and a decentering of the dominant culture from teaching, be it decolonization or anti-racism.
Yeah, and the word you're saying too is honesty. Like it takes courage, it takes humility, and to actually look at ourselves truthfully of how our decisions, how our perceptions, how we spend our money is harmful in all of the ways that it's harmful. And so it really, it does take an individual to own up to their own heartbreak and their own suffering. And I can see why people don't do that, right? I think it is, it's an important, but it also is a courageous act of removing our ignorance.
And, a lot of these issues are also rooted in capitalism, right? Because most yoga platforms, in fact, all yoga platforms, mainstream yoga platforms, are very focused on the capitalism behind what are they selling? Why are they selling it? And so we also then have to, and it's easy to point the finger, oh, this platform should be doing that, this platform should be doing that. Absolutely. Platforms have to take accountability as well. But it's also down to the consumer. Because if the most searchful thing in yoga is sequencing, as an example, then that's really the consumer that has to now begin to invite themselves to be looking at yoga through a different lens, to be looking at yoga beyond asana, beyond sequencing. And again, this isn't an attack on asana or sequencing. Hopefully, we're sequencing a full class. I've been to many classes where that hasn't been the case, and you wish the teacher had a better focus on sequencing, especially safe sequencing, accessible sequencing. But yeah, I think we as consumers, we have power, right? And very often we don't step into our power or utilize our power and begin to ask the question of, okay, well, what are we doing? I can't control everybody else, right? But I can control myself. I can control what I am thinking, what I am doing, where I am spending my time, where I am investing my resources. And so these are the questions that we, especially the dominant culture, I invite you to be asking yourself, right? And it's not easy work, especially, listen, I'm not a part of the dominant culture. I'm a highly melanated, also South Asian woman. So my lived experience is even very different because of colorism to a light-skinned South Asian woman, right? So me navigating the world as I have done in my life, I can't imagine what it would be like to constantly be centered in every conversation, every room that you walk into. It must be great. No wonder the dominant culture doesn't want to divest. But this is a part of why we practice the philosophy of yoga. And, let's be honest. And I wrote an article that went viral for InStyle magazine in October 2022, which was titled The Rise of White Supremacy in Yoga. And if you haven't read it, Blair, perhaps you can share that in the show notes or as a link in this conversation. And it was not embraced, that's putting it mildly, within the community that I live in Orange County. In fact, I was vilified, attacked, physically threatened, abused, and the list goes on. And, I'll say this, when people of color highlight that there is a problem, we're doing it for the sake of everybody. And, this is also a lot of the problems that we see in America, as an example, are highly prevalent within yoga and wellness spaces. Anti-Black Lives Matter, anti-science, anti-vaccination, anti-collective liberation. All of these things are happening in yoga studios, in yoga environments, in mainstream yoga and beyond. And so that's why adopting a decolonial perspective is vital, because so much of this delusion is what we see play out in yoga in the West.
Thank you. I also shared the article, and for anyone in the recording, we'll make sure that the article is linked, as well as the link to Anusha's book and her website as well. And I know that we had talked about that before, but just speaking it to it again, I'm sorry that you were met with violence when you were speaking to violence within yogic communities.
Thank you. And honestly, what I will say to that is it's my practice. It's the philosophy of yoga. It's my practice that has kept me anchored in general in my life, but specifically over the past few years. And that it's also an invitation to, if we really practice yoga, it holds us up. It nourishes us, it caresses us. And I think what really saddens me is that's not what we're sold or told. So the beauty of the practice is being negated. And so it isn't that helpful to people in these times. That's also a problem, right? Asana, which I love, right, gives us, it's like a quick fix, if that makes sense. So you feel, great after you've done your class. But really, it's the philosophy of yoga and the meditative, what we call the sadhana, your daily sadhana, your daily spiritual practice. That's going to be what will really hold you and uplift you in these times. So if we're not having that as a complement to asana, the asana in a way becomes very empty.
And I agree. I have never been more grateful these last few years to have a spiritual practice, something that I take refuge in, something that I surrender to, something that I am held in, because I see people unraveling all around me, and it's heartbreaking to watch people suffer. And you can't come in and rescue, being like, I have the cure, and point in all these different places. But like you're saying, like living your yoga, right? It is part of your daily practice. It is part of your being. It's part of your essence. It's how you walk in the world.
Absolutely. The practice of yoga is how are we showing up outside of, off our yoga mat, off our meditation cushion. How are we showing up in the world around us? And we are truly living in a time that is filled with so much suffering. And so the beauty, I think, really of a practice of yoga is that we can lean into those areas of discomfort, like I've shared, through the actual understanding of the philosophical aspects of yoga and that meditation practice, that mindfulness practice. So it can help us to show up, right? But it can also help us to feel joy and to embrace joy in our daily lives. And embracing joy, or santosha, contentment, is a form of resistance, especially for BIPOC in the time that we are in. It's important that all of us are embracing joy whenever and wherever we can. And, often what I see when, on social media or in various places about yoga, I think this isn't, if you understood what yoga really was, then you would be able to lean into discomfort. And at the same time, you'd be able to embrace joy. It's not one or the other, right? It's both.
Yeah. And being able to hold the paradox of this world. But that's Eastern philosophy. That's the philosophy of Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, especially Hinduism and Buddhism, where life is suffering. That's the duality of life, right? One isn't necessarily good or bad. We need both, and we are living in both. So how do we use the framework of yoga as a philosophy to understand that duality of life, to understand what we call in yogic philosophy the samsara? What is that? That is the continual cycle of birth, life, and death. And that then will help us to understand how we can stand up, right?
and show up in the world around us, but at the same time coming from a place of love, coming from a place of compassion, coming from a place of non-judgment, while also understanding that anger and frustration and judgment are also necessary as catalysts for change. This also baffles me. We see all of this, oh, I must only show love and compassion and whatever else, love and light and, et cetera, et cetera. Yet, anger and frustration are necessary aspects of our practice also. We can't just negate negative emotions. And very often we're told to do, oh, well, just forget about that. The toxic positivity, the spiritual bypassing, the emotional bypassing, that is antithetical to yoga philosophy as well. We are never going to get to the root cause of our suffering, our own suffering, forget about collective suffering, if we are negating our trauma, our feelings, our emotions, and our own pain. The practice of yoga enables us to lean into that in order to transcend and liberate ourselves from it. So we've got to sit with that anger. We've got to sit with that, whatever it is, envy, jealousy, anger, hatred, the list goes on. And to turn a lens at looking at those, what we often perceive to be very negative emotions in the West, not necessarily as negative or positive, but as necessary catalysts in our own evolution, right? Internally and externally.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a question in the Q&A box, and I think this would be a time where we can transition. Does that work for you?
That's great. Yeah, I'd love to start hearing from people.
Okay, great. So just to repeat, the Zoom box on your screen, there's a black bar at the bottom. Towards the right-hand side, there's kind of like a toggle that says Q&A, and you can type your question into there. I think you also have the option to type anonymous if you didn't want your name said as well. So the first question that we have is, as a yoga teacher, I struggle with the ethics of teaching and even practicing yoga, given that I am British heritage and have no cultural or ancestral ties to the practice. I came to it through Western commercialization of asana and upheld white capitalism by completing both my teacher trainings at studios owned by white women. Even with the knowledge and commitment to the yamas and niyamas, I can't disconnect from the feelings of cultural appropriation. Do you have thoughts and guidance?
Yes. And, Blair, you and I and Bill were talking about this. I mean, that would be, I would say, thank you for sharing that. That's probably most people's experience. And there's nothing wrong to me with coming to yoga from a Western perspective, or your first introduction to yoga was through asana, or whatever the case. That's most people's introduction to yoga in the West, and that's absolutely fine. I think it's important now, as a part of your practice, to then, like I said, how can you, given what you've shared, support and amplify the work of South Asian teachers? And there's so many out there. Myself and Dr. Shyam Ranganathan, who I just heard you're interviewing next month, so definitely go to his webinar. He's a dear brother to me and a sibling and a friend and an esteemed colleague. And we're currently leading a yoga origins, lineages, and cultural appropriation training. So I invite you to come to trainings like that, to find South Asian teachers and learn from them, because it's going to give you a completely different mindset and framework within which to operate, and to then focus on how you can repair harm. Yeah. And there is so much harm specifically continually being done against South Asian teachers. I mean, here's an example. Go to Barnes & Noble, any Barnes & Noble, and go to the yoga and meditation section, and how many authors of South Asian heritage are in there? That number one are alive, right? 0 from what I see. Barnes & Noble, as an example, refused to stock my book. So, and when you go into any Barnes & Noble, it's always white people that are centered within these spaces. And so that's continuing to this day, right? And no, we're not necessarily going to change capitalism. We're not going to change these large corporations, but we as individuals have power, right? So how are we divesting? How are we amplifying the work of South Asians? Dr. Shyam Ranganathan has books you can purchase. I have, and there's countless other South Asian teachers who you can support and amplify their work by buying our books, by coming to our trainings, and by spreading the message to others, quite frankly. And most of us are doing our work as outliers, within this space. So for our work to have any momentum, we need support.
Thank you. And speaking to that, I dropped the link for, you can register for a newsletter, which is my understanding, for the Yoga Origins, Lineage, and Cultural Appropriation training. So the link will give you more information for that. And then I also linked Anusha's book again. And then we've got more questions rolling in, which is great. Keep them coming. Quick question for Anusha. Are you still sharing offerings on Patreon? Where can we further engage with your studies, meditation, and yoga practice? Is there a Sangha that we can join? And thank you so deeply for your powerful share.
Thank you. I'm so bad sometimes at actually talking about what sometimes my own offerings. But yes, thank you for that. I do have a Patreon. And the reason that I created this Patreon, it was a number of things. Number one, meditation isn't accessible. And meditation taught by South Asian teachers specifically isn't accessible. And two main reasons I created my Patreon. Blair, I don't know if you can, it's via linked at my Instagram. So perhaps you can go and share that direct link. Number one reason I created the Patreon, I'll go back to the article. So when I wrote the article, even though I'm the eternal optimist, it wasn't well received in my own community, I got immense support from around the world. And as a result of that, I was able to connect with people that I would never have had the fortune to meet, who were having very similar, and people of the dominant culture as well, people from all over the world that wanted to divest from what was happening in yoga, right? And so that's one of the reasons I created the Patreon, so we can come together in Sangha and we can adopt a decolonial mindset. We can have a commitment to being both anti-racist and pro-science. I also wanted to give people access to the clinical program that I'm testing. And so every patron gets access to the meditation program that I'm clinically testing at Hoag Hospital, which we are proving to be effective, which is great. So I wanted to make, one of my main goals is also how can I make meditation and mindfulness accessible? And honestly, that's one of the main reasons I wrote this book. I realized in my work at the hospital that the 30 minutes that I get with breast cancer patients just isn't enough. And so I was like, what can I do? And I never had an aspiration to write a book. And, by divine guidance, this opportunity came to me and I wrote this book, and it was really just a very simple guide as to how you can adopt a meditation practice that can work from you at home. And there are 9 intentions that you can live with. And this book came out, during the pandemic, but I wrote it before I had no idea that we would really need some of those intentional living whilst we were all at home. So the Patreon, you get access to the meditation program. There are 3 different accessibly priced tiers, and we have a monthly satsang where we come together in community and we get to connect with people from around the country and around the world, so we can really build an alternate yoga space. Mm-hmm. And it just is wonderful to meet so many people, and so many white people as well from the dominant culture who were truly committed to doing this work. So that's a way that you can connect with me outside of this setting and support my work. But also, more importantly, we come together every month to be in Sangha and community with each other, to hold each other, to amplify and support.
Thank you. We dropped the Patreon. I actually never knew how to say it. Patreon?
I say Patreon, but I'm from England, so I'm not sure is it Patreon? Is it Patreon?
No, I also don't know. And I'd say minimum mild dyslexia as well. So it looks like there's some letters that are mixed up for me. So I'm personally not sure. But we shared that link there. So this is a really beautiful community that you can join. Is there a specific date that you meet each month?
Yeah. So it tends to be a Monday, and it tends to be around 1:00 Pacific time, trying to make it accessible to other people in different time zones. But I always record it. So people that join that tier will have access to it and can watch the recording and be in that kind of virtual container.
Thank you. And we're still taking more questions. So any questions, please hop into the chat, or if it's more accessible for you, you can put it directly into the chat box or the question and answer box. But while people are bringing questions forward, is there anything that hasn't been said yet, Anusha, that you want to bring in to the conversation?
I would really just like to hear from the audience and yourself, Blair. Honestly, I mean, I think that to me is, I can talk about a multitude of different things, but I really want it to be relevant to this audience. And so I would really want to open it up to people. And really, for me, it's this community dialogue that is the richest part, and what makes me, my heart smile and feel warmth inside is connecting with all of you. So I no question is a silly question. I would love to hear from people and yourself as well, Blair.
Thank you. So we do have a question. What are your thoughts on yoga retreats made up largely of white folks to places like Southeast Asia or other destinations in the global South?
I mean, part of my own practice is I'm not here to say, don't do this and do this. And I think that's just how I teach. So for me, these are all invitations. I mean, I think, again, there's nothing wrong with going as a white person and doing a retreat in said location. We know that it does become problematic, and certainly has been in yoga and wellness spaces. And this is an example when people have traveled to the Indian subcontinent and to India as white women specifically. And then it's the white saviorism that takes place, right? It's the playing out of the images of white women with underserved children, and almost that, again, rooted. So you're going on this retreat and then you're saying, I'm doing savor, but you're centering yourself. And you're centering yourself in a way that plays into that white saviorism. So I think anybody doing that, it's highly problematic. And of course, I just say India, that happens often in Africa, that happens in South and Central America, that happens in other parts of Asia. This obviously isn't something that is just unique to India. So again, this is an invitation, right? And there has been so much harm. This was the norm. Think about this. Even a few years ago, this was much the norm. I think it's very problematic, I would say, when I see white folks leading retreats to, let's take Peru as an example, and then leading, indigenous practices in those countries, or white folks, for example, leading sweat lodges here. White folks, again, continuing to center and profit off indigenous practices that are not theirs. And so, yes, obviously that's happening in yoga, but it's happening in many other indigenous practices in many other countries as well. I also think that there is this exoticization, right, that happens, which is a part of neocolonialism with white people in particular. Or, and this like, I'm going to go to this exotic location, and I'm going to do a number of different indigenous practices that aren't my own. And then I'm going to sell it again back to the dominant culture and even to indigenous people from whom those practices have come. So I think it's really important, if you are part of the dominant culture and you're doing a yoga retreat, to be incredibly mindful, right? And to be really adopting that decolonial mindset and listening and learning from South Asian and BIPOC voices about how you can do less harm and how you can focus on repairing harm. And very often these questions aren't asked because people don't care. They just want to sell the retreat. They want to sell their class. And they want to, and like I said, it probably is difficult being a part of the dominant culture to decenter yourself when you've always been centered. So that's another way for us to practice yoga philosophy and to work on removing, those mental afflictions of the mind that inhibit us from seeing our true selves.
Thank you. I have a question, and then we have another question in the Q&A box. It takes a moment, and then people, they muster courage, and then you get like a ton of questions towards the end, right? But I can feel that the question and answer is warming up. But okay, so say someone owns a yoga studio, hiring teachers that are South Asian, right? What are other ways that if someone has a physical yoga space, I know maybe some people on this call, or definitely maybe people on the recording as well, what are other ways that someone can decolonize their space?
So what we used to often hear from yoga studio owners specifically was their proximity to people of color, right? Well, I live in a community that's all white people, and so therefore I just can't find any teachers of color, which I live in a very, very white community. There are still people of color myself included within this community. So yes, you can find people. It isn't just that there hasn't been that genuine want or desire to. I will also say that if you're struggling to find South Asian teachers or teachers of color, there's always virtual offerings now. So yes, obviously you can have your in-studio classes, but you can also make that intention of having virtual offerings and supporting South Asian teachers and teachers of color beyond live in-person offerings. Because we're now in a time where we're all used to doing things online, right? We've been doing that for the past 2 years. We continue to do that. I think the deeper question is, do people really have a true commitment to doing that? And the answer for the most part is no. I have met some yoga studio owners, some of whom are part of my Patreon, that are very much committed to decolonizing their studio space and supporting South Asian teachers and supporting BIPOC teachers and genuinely supporting them and making that investment, right? And so very often I get this from yoga teachers where they're like, I want to teach more than asana, but the space that I'm teaching in doesn't want me to do that. And so then it also is that, what is the studio trying to achieve? And most of the time it's to get more membership, right? They have their rent, their bills, etc. to pay. They want to get the people in. People mainly want asana. So then it's that dedication and commitment as a yoga studio owner to you decolonizing your understanding of yoga and doing that as a journey with your teachers, right? Mm-hmm. And your students and your members. So to make it this collective journey versus, and we hear this often, like, I really wanted to add meditation, but nobody comes to that class. Well, yeah, you've got it at like some bizarre time that nobody can attend often, right? So maybe prioritize that as a studio, put it at a time which is one of your more popular times, and continue to market, promote it, and stand behind it. Don't day 2 of offering cancel it because 2 people have shown up. You know, the work of decolonizing yoga isn't going to be popular. It isn't popular, unfortunately. So it is going to take a true dedication and commitment to platforming and showcasing yoga beyond asana in any space.
Thank you. And I really love this invitation of it being a journey with you and your yoga teachers, right? You're like, okay, like this is part of the collective. We are changing the space and let's all do this together.
Right. And let's educate, and not you educate, but invite South Asians, teachers of other people that are not part of the dominant culture, but specifically when it comes to the topic of decolonizing yoga, South Asians, as that is our history of colonization. And I will say this, I'm not sure if people were aware, but during the colonization of South Asia and the Indian subcontinent, yoga was illegal. It was banned. Our temples were desecrated. It's why the home altar in Hindu homes became very popular. We were not allowed to practice our philosophy, our ancestral wisdom, our way of worship, because it was in direct contradiction to the Abrahamic religions, right? So we also have to understand that we had to resist yoga being banned. And so to now have it commercialized and bastardized and sold back to us, and to continue to have our voices erased from these conversations is very problematic and very traumatic for South Asians.
Yeah, re-traumatizing of intergenerational trauma.
And remember as well, we have a very recent history of colonization. India gained independence in 1947 through great resistance. Sri Lanka gained independence off the back of India in 1948. That's in some of our lifetimes. So this wasn't something that happened it was going on for hundreds of years. However, this is recent history, and it's recent history that has been whitewashed and not told and purposefully negated from conversations in mainstream yoga and wellness. Because, of course, why would you want to learn the true history when you continue to profit off this whitewashed version of what yoga is?
And bringing it into the conversation, too, is what's happening in Sri Lanka right now.
That's like a whole conversation. Yeah. I mean, I'll say this. I am Sri Lankan Tamil. I began my work in social justice 20 years ago, actually working with Sri Lankan migrants who were deemed as refugees and asylum seekers. I've been doing this work for a long time. It's very dear to my heart. But it is what yoga is. It is that intersection of yoga and social justice. What's happening in Sri Lanka is devastating, but it's devastating for a number of reasons. And this is the history that's never taught. So Sri Lanka gained independence in 1948. And what colonization and colonialism did very well was to pit one against the other, that ethos, that mindset of divide and rule. As soon as the British left, we had the Sinhala Buddhist majority that turned on the ethnic Sri Lankan Tamils, predominantly who were Hindu. And this began with the Bandaranaike, who was the Sri Lankan president at the time, that brought in the Sinhala Only Act and started overt discrimination against the ethnic Tamils and ethnic violence against ethnic Tamils back in the 1950s, so very soon after independence. So number one, the impact of colonization is still very much alive and living. The legacy of colonization, we see that in India with the issues with India and Pakistan. And so even though Britain has had, and I'm British, the home of white supremacy, a dreadful legacy that still plays out, right? And that's often what people don't realize. So number one, a lot of the problems that we see in the Indian subcontinent are a direct result of colonization. And so, what's happening now in Sri Lanka is a great lesson to all of us about what happens when we do not stand up for collective care and liberation. Because interestingly, what people don't know is Rajapaksa, the disgraced Sri Lankan president, is a war criminal and was democratically re-elected by the Sinhala Buddhist majority. That's what's left. I'm not seeing any of that nuance played out, apart from in the Tamil Guardian, which if you have the link, please share it. It's a wonderful space for a decolonized mindset and news about what's really going on in that area. And so unfortunately, it isn't that surprising that, you re-elect a war criminal who was directly responsible for ethnic cleansing and genocide of Sri Lankan Tamils. And now, he turns into this autocratic, corrupt dictator. It's not surprising given the history and given the context. That's the nuance that we are not seeing in mainstream media. So yes, absolutely, the man had to go. He had to go decades ago. But this is what happens. And a great lesson, honestly, in the urgency for us all to focus on collective liberation and collective care, because what happens to one person, it's going to happen to us, whether we want it to or not. And that is exactly what is playing out in Sri Lanka and has been over the years since independence.
And thank you for speaking and educating to the history, right? And you're like, actually, it's not surprising. This is a war criminal, right? And you saw all of the precursors, right? All of the steps to see where we are now, and that the media is not talking about that nuance or that story, right? Of that unfolding, that they're talking, oh, this is shocking, and it's been happening the last 2 years, right? And you're like, no, it's decades and decades. And
I will also say the Tamil Guardian shared some MPs, Labour MPs, I believe, in the UK, calling out British Parliament, because a lot of the Tories, the Conservative government, went on holidays funded by Rajapaksa, and calling out, people probably again aren't aware of this, but as a result of ethnic cleansing, we had different waves of migration. So my parents left in the early 70s to the UK as economic migrants because they had the means to do so. And that's why many of us were born outside of Sri Lanka. And then we had different waves of migration that occurred as a result of the civil war and ethnic cleansing and genocide. The largest diaspora of Sri Lankan Tamil people is in Canada. And then the second largest diaspora is in the UK. So we have a lot of Sri Lankan Tamils. And MPs, and go and watch the Tamil Guardian where they shared all these clips of MPs just calling it what it is. A lot of the West doesn't even name the genocide and ethnic cleansing against Sri Lankan Tamils that has occurred in Sri Lanka for decades. And so this is what happens when we whitewash history. This is what happens when we don't offer a nuanced perspective. This is what happens when we don't have a historical context of what's happening. And so, his demise is long overdue, but sad that it had to happen in this way, right? There's the Sinhalese. And again, people often don't realize, listen, there's extremism in all religions, but specifically ethnic cleansing and genocide was led by Sinhalese Buddhist monastics, which obviously has got nothing to do with Buddhism. And we also see this play out in Rohingya as well. So that kind of Buddhist violent extremism, which again is often unreported, right? Where do we see and hear and read about this? So
You don't.
Exactly. We don't. Because the news, but the news of black and brown people dying as a result of ethnic cleansing and genocide isn't seen as newsworthy, unfortunately. So, yeah. I mean, as you can see, that could be just a topic in of itself. But again, this is all coming back to how do we adopt a decolonial mindset? How do we decolonize yoga? How do we decolonize wellness? And this is all interrelated. And what we also have to understand is our liberation is not only interconnected, it's also intersectional. And Sri Lanka is a great example of what happens when we do not stand up for collective liberation and collective care. And there were many Sinhalese people that did, right? So that's the point. There are many white people that stood up, right, against segregation, against colonization, against apartheid. So it's not to say, oh, the dominant culture doesn't have people who have been activists over the years. That's untrue. There have been many white people and people in the dominant culture that have stood up and been allies. And so this is an invitation to the dominant culture. How can you continue to be allies, but more importantly, co-conspirators and agents of change within your community and beyond?
Thank you. I'm going to continue with more questions. You mentioned the phrase decolonize has lost its potency. Is there another phrase or concept that you feel can be added to transmute or re-inspire the meaning?
I'm just going to keep saying decolonizing because I've been saying it for years and I'm going to continue to say it. I personally don't buy into, it's over. It's not over because we're still living in a highly colonized society. So to me, I think that's part of the problem. People wanting to change phrases. And listen, it is decolonization, period. And until we can really break it down and start to live it, it doesn't help us to start bringing in new terminology when we haven't even actually done the first thing. So to me, continue the work. Everything trends. It goes in ebbs and flows, right? So are we able to continue the work of decolonization beyond it not being a trendy hashtag or trending slogan? Because that's where the real work lies.
Thank you. What are your thoughts on, if any, Kemetic yoga?
So we cover this extensively in Yoga Origins, Lineages, and Cultural Appropriation. Again, that's like another lecture that I give. And I'll say this. I think, number one, being in academia and working in research, I always really want to focus on evidence-based information. So I think when we think of yoga, yoga is specifically indigenous to South Asia and the Indian subcontinent. And the word itself comes from the Sanskrit word yuj, which is first mentioned in the Rig Veda. So think about yoga as a practice that's 6,000 years old. And we have that, archaeological, linguistic, historical text, etc., reference to that. I think it becomes, it's sad when we try to lump all BIPOC indigenous practices under the one umbrella. So when I think of Kemetic practices of ancient Egypt, which I don't refer to as yoga because it isn't yoga. Yoga, again, like I've mentioned, is indigenous to South Asia. It's a philosophy. It seems that, ancient Egyptians were practicing their form of intentional movement, their form of breath work. And there were plenty of other indigenous cultures around the world that were also doing their own version of that. What we have to understand, and again, adopting that decolonial mindset, is everything isn't yoga. But the reason that we want to make everything yoga is, of course, it sells. And, beyond Kemetic practices, think of beer yoga, goat yoga, trap yoga, all of these things that have got nothing to do with yoga. Listen, animal therapy is great. I love animals, but it really has got nothing to do with yoga. If we want to engage with touching animals, I've never been to a goat yoga class. I would find that really kind of confusing too. Like I'm trying to do asana and the goats. I've seen like videos of it, like what, exactly jumping on you. And I think that would be great to just do. Everything doesn't have to be yoga. Again, let's talk about beer yoga. They're not drinking the beer after yoga. They're doing this in my own community. They're drinking it during the class. Bizarre to me again and curious, right? Because I think to myself, okay, yoga is actually a form of movement. It's also a form of exercise. Are we doing that when we're on a Peloton? Are we doing that when we're running? Are we doing that in any kind of other intentional movement, physical exercise class? And the answer is, as we all know, we're not. So everything isn't yoga. And part of adopting that decolonial mindset is understanding that. And just, if you want to drink, but don't call it yoga. If you want to have animals running around, wonderful, but that isn't yoga. So I think, and again, we know why everybody wants everything to be yoga. Because of the paradigm of white supremacy, we have thought yoga to be something that it isn't. And just tagging the word yoga onto anything that we're doing sells. So that's why.
Thank you. What are your thoughts on the entities that attempt to regulate yoga teacher trainings or set RYT requirements and standards? I have heard BIPOC people who have raised in yoga traditions speak of having to take a 200-hour YTT in order to teach yoga and get the adequate insurance they need to do so. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's definitely problematic. I myself with Yoga Alliance, they're a huge part of the problem. And this governing body that, quite frankly, what are you governing? Because most of what you're telling people to teach has got absolutely nothing to do with yoga. So I think it's also a way for these governing bodies. And you're right, it's a problem, obviously, when you have a studio and there's licensing around it. And again, I just want to say this isn't the situation of, I don't think people should do 200 or 300-hour trainings. I think there are some phenomenal yoga trainings out there that offer, and especially centered around issues, BIPOC-centered, BIPOC-led. Dianne Bondy, one of my very dear friends, has both 200 and 300-hour yoga teacher trainings that are very much focused on equity and justice, and through that lens. There are lots of BIPOC teachers out there. South Asian teacher Susanna Bakataki has her own kind of online programming where she also offers these trainings. So I think it's really important that if we are going to look at doing a teacher training, which can be incredibly helpful to us, to be looking at whose voice is centered and who is actually running the training and what the actual educational curriculum is in that training.
Thank you. I'm just going fast because we're almost at time and we've got 2 more questions.
Right.
Perhaps somewhat off topic, but in my exposure, hi, my name is Blair. What's your name?
Surya.
So nice to meet you. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, so here we have my son, Surya, who is named after Lord Surya, who is the Vedic and Hindu deity of the sun, who actually, if though we could decolonize asana right now in this moment, who we do Surya Namaskar to. Sun salutations A and B are in direct reverence and honor of the chief solar deity, and a little bit of Vedic astrology here. It's the chief deity of the Navagraha, who, if you've ever been to a Hindu temple, there are 9 Vedic planets, and Lord Surya is also said to represent our soul.
Thank you. Surya, it's so nice to meet you. Thank you for joining us.
I was wondering when we would have a guest. And here he is.
He's so beautiful. Thank you. Perhaps somewhat off topic, but in all of my exposure to history of yoga taught by white people, it was always presented as something for the Brahmin class, not available to women, not available to lower or non-religious classes. It's almost as if Western practice is presented as a liberator of yoga to bring it to more people, less classist, etc. Can you shed light on a broader, more comprehensive history of yoga beyond it was for the priests and now it's here in the West?
Sorry, I need to read this. Perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that in itself is a very, and you're right. I think how yoga was sold and constructed in the West is specifically around lineages. And again, this is what we're breaking down in Yoga Origins, Lineages, and Cultural Appropriation. We tackle these difficult questions that often aren't talked about in the mainstream. We also actually talk about caste and this, the way that yoga has been presented in the West, and even the origins of caste. Caste itself is actually a Portuguese word, if you're not familiar. Where we have mentions of caste, it's actually varna, which doesn't actually translate to caste. It would be more color, if you will. So, and there's a lot, again, we're not going to be able to deconstruct that question within the context of the conversation that we're having today. But I encourage you, if you want to learn, you could actually currently sign up for the training. And in the next session, we'll be specifically covering lineages and the idea of lineages in the West. So please come and learn. This is why we offer these trainings, where we get to actually unpack these questions and what our concept is of yoga in the West, what our concept is of lineages in the West, and even what our concept is of practicing yoga within South Asia.
Thank you. And I'm really excited about your yoga origins, lineage, and cultural appropriation training. So you have, we have a link there. And so you can sign up for a mailing list so you can continue to be notified about this training and next year's dates. And then I'm trying to find Dianne Bondy's website. I'm not finding it.
I'll pop that in the chat box now whilst you're getting the next question.
Perfect. Kind of the double awareness. I was not able to find it, so thank you so much. Next question. As a person of Indigenous and queer identity, and as a yoga teacher, lately I have been feeling tokenized by some yoga studio experiences when searching for places to teach and represent underserved communities, diverse culture, and even searching for Southeastern teachers and mentors. Do you have any advice or thoughts on how to navigate with this with authentic grace, wisdom, and self-agency? Thank you.
I mean, this is a problem. So thank you, Dolores Doc, for sharing this. Yeah, there's a lot of tokenization. There's a lot of performative action, especially and performative nature of pretending to be an ally when in theory you either A, just want to tick a box, or B, you just want to also tokenize by centering yourself. And we see this very often in these conversations around people's commitment to decolonization, people's commitment to anti-racism, people's commitment to being allies to LGBTQIA plus communities, QT BIPOC communities. And it's difficult, you know, and I don't really have, like, I wish I had a great answer for that. And I think this is really an invitation for the dominant culture specifically to do more than that. You know, and we all saw this post the murder of George Floyd, the plethora of hashtag Black Lives Matter, the Black Square. We saw white people suddenly coming, certainly I myself, wanting to take more trainings by South Asians and people of color. During Pride Month, as an example, we saw all of the corporations doing the rainbow washing, right? Everywhere we turned, there was a pride flag. And you're thinking to yourself, well, how are you actually really supporting the LGBTQIA plus and, you know, specifically even QT BIPOC communities? And they're not, right? So we are now in this time where it's become trendy to do the Heritage Month and and this isn't to say that Heritage Months aren't useful. I personally am not a huge fan of them, because to me, it's how are we having a commitment to these groups beyond the month, right? And to often these marginalized groups from mainstream society who don't, aside from whatever the Heritage Month is, get platformed or any of those opportunities. And how are you, as the dominant culture, corporations, yoga studio owners, whether you're working for a yoga platform, even as a consumer, how are you moving beyond that performative nature of allyship and becoming a true co-conspirator and agent of change? And I just want to, preface that by saying, there's a lot going on in the world around us. I myself am flooded every day with people, with news and with requests for help. And, I wish I was Oprah or a billionaire and I could help everybody. I mean, I can't. And so on my modest platform. And so it's the wider question. What I do in my own personal practice is I focus on longer term sustainability to the work that I'm doing. I can't do it all. I can't post about every issue. I can't donate to every issue. I can't support every marginalized group, coming from a marginalized group myself, but I can do what I can do. And so what I try to do as part of my own sadhana spiritual practice is focus on sustainability in the work of activism and social justice and that longer term collaboration. Who can I really support? Who can I align with? How can I uplift and platform and amplify, but do it for longer than one time or 1 month? And that might be much less, right? But to me, it's also like, well, this is what I'm able to do in the time that I have. And so I'm going to focus on doing that with that, again, commitment to sustainability within the work that I'm doing. I also, just in terms of, and how we can decolonize where we spend and donate our money, the resources that we support, I specifically also focusing on supporting BIPOC-centered organizations who are BIPOC-led, because very often that's actually not the case. It often tends to be white folks dominating not-for-profits, NGOs that are helping BIPOC communities. So also let's look into who these organizations are and how we can support them. 3 of my favorites are Seeding Sovereignty, which is Indigenous-led, focused on Indigenous-led solutions to problems and issues in America. Blair, if you can share that. The National Bailout, Black-centered, Black-led, amazing organization, very relevant to the work that you're doing here at the Prison Yoga Project. Mm-hmm. They do amazing work and amazing campaigns. And then I also support a very good friend of mine, Stacey Berry, who is a Black African-American woman based in St. Louis. And she has a nonprofit called the Yoga Pipeline Project, which specifically focuses on that school to prison pipeline. And she doesn't have large scale philanthropy, or even regular donors. So to me, it's like, if we can support individuals like her and the other 2 organizations that I've talked about, it directly impacts on the work that they're doing. And Stacey goes herself and teaches yoga within inner city schools in the St. Louis area, which is very segregated from what I've heard, and focuses specifically on that school to prison pipeline. So those are the organizations that you can support. And I invite you to, especially with Stacey's work too. And she'd be a great guest, Blair, for one of your future webinars.
We would love to have her. We have specifically a youth-centered and focused webinar series. So if you think that she would want to be a guest, we would absolutely love to support her and uplift her work.
And she's doing amazing work. So these are ways, and some people, and I know we're over time, but I just want to end by saying, each of us can't solve every problem in the world, right? But by tackling ones that you're most passionate about, and what I'm passionate about, you might not be passionate about, and that's okay. To me, there isn't a right or wrong. There isn't everybody should be doing this. Listen, find your passion. With that focus on that intersection of yoga, wellness, and social justice, given the context of the time that we are in, given that is what yoga philosophy teaches us, really, and find ways that you can sustain your activism on a daily basis, because that's when it's going to have a lasting impact.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Really keeping our practices sustainable. So we're not in and out in 6 months and just digging a lot of really shallow holes, right? You're like, okay, no, actually I want to support. And the way that we can support is through long-term sustainable action.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I'll end by saying this. In the 2020, I've been teaching decolonization specifically for 7 years now. And in 2020, I had like 200 people coming to trainings, more than I've ever had before. First, when I started, nobody came. I just want to put that out there. And it was a donation class. And then 2 people came, and I was delighted, because to me, whether it's 2 people or 200 people, I'm still going to be doing the work. And now I might have 25 people come. But you know what? That's richer to me. That's deeper to me, because the 25 people that are showing up now have a deep commitment to unlearning and relearning, and a deep commitment to doing this work. And that's actually more valuable than 200 or 500 people that are coming just to check a box.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming and sharing with our wide community of practitioners and social justice advocates and activists. I'm so excited that you were able to join us. Anyone on the recording, we're going to definitely have all of these links up. And also anyone in our community, we will continue to remind you of Anusha's future trainings. And Anusha, that's also an invitation of anything that you're offering. Please continue to stay in contact with us so we can tell our audience as well.
And I've just shared my Instagram. It's where I'm most active, and I would love to stay connected to all of you. So you can follow me at Shanti Within, and I post a lot about the work that I do and that kind of intersection of yoga, wellness, and social justice. So I'd love to stay connected with you all.
Yes. Thank you so much, Anusha. Thank you.
Thank you. And I did share Dianne Bondy's training. If you go to her website, because someone's asked that, Jessica, I think, has mentioned that again. So I've shared Dianne Bondy's training, and she does the 200-hour and the 300-hour. And I could give you what I try to do is just offer a few resources. Otherwise, it just becomes overwhelming. So she's amazing and has a very much, she's focused and has been doing this work for decades as well. Also doing work around toxic diet culture and fat shaming. And body neutrality, body positivity. And I would, again, I would love for you to have her as a guest on this. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyone that you feel that would be great for our community to hear from their voices. And really the point of this webinar is to uplift people and the work that they're doing, and to continue to weave community of people that want to serve, right? And feel that yoga is a path of service. So thank you.
Yeah, and thank you. And hopefully we can do this again, because, I loved all the questions that were coming in. And I think they're great questions that we often don't have time to unpack everything in the time that we have, but necessary to really, understanding, what is yoga, what isn't yoga, and what is the colonized version of yoga that has been packaged and continues to be sold. So thank you all so, so much.
Thank you.
Exactly. Dolores has said, and Susanna Barkataki, who I mentioned earlier, I mentioned the two, Dianne Bondy and Susanna Barkataki. She also offers a variety of different online trainings, and specifically platform South Asian Voices. And sorry, I will add, and I know that I talked about Dr. Shyam Ranganathan, if you can put his link in here as well, or he's your guest next month from what Bill was saying, he actually also has a platform purely dedicated to decolonizing and unpacking yoga philosophy. So I highly recommend him. He was going to be one of my suggestions, but you have him next month.
Yeah, it was really perfect how they ended up meeting. And then when I looked him up online, that you guys already had a training together, I was like, oh my gosh, okay, this is totally perfect. So he's amazing. If you can join for his, please do. He is an esteemed scholar, historian, author, and professor of philosophy at York University in Canada. So that's one not to miss. And it is not up on our website just yet, but Friday, August 5th, we will have him as our guest. So stay tuned. Wonderful. Yeah. Well, thank you all so, so much. Lots of love to you all. Stay well. And I hope to stay connected with you all. Yes. Thank you, Blair. Thank you, Anusha. Take care. Bye-bye.